whatever happens, I think all the colleges here will do the same thing. Nobody will want to be the first to open completely or the last. And so I think there'll be a kind of herd, maybe not herd immunity, but there'll be herd behavior. Everybody will follow whoever the first big mover is to announce exactly what they're doing.
And with that, we're live. Okay, so I think we're going to go ahead and get started now. Thank you very much for joining this third virtual ASN event, which is dedicated to teaching nationalism in turbulent times. I'm Paul Good, Associate Professor in Department of Politics, Languages, and International Studies at the University of Bath. Now, as of this morning, we had about 300 registered participants, and hopefully many more are joining us even as we speak. This panel grew out of a general idea that as a scholarly association, ASN can and should do more than present cutting-edge research on nationalism. Teaching is an important part of our work. It's important to the association's members, it's important to our students, obviously. And so we had planned a discussion broadly around teaching for this year's conference. Of course, 2020 has had other things in store for us. Now, arguably, we've been living through turbulent times for several years now with rising populism and the spread of authoritarianism globally. But I think it's fair to say that this year we have seen a real step change in global turbulence. First, of course, the pandemic happened. And suddenly we weren't just talking about teaching nationalism, but how to understand and teach about nationalist and populist responses to COVID-19. And more than that, we've been learning how to teach in new formats, how to teach online or in hybrid formats. More recently, the killing of George Floyd and the global wave of protest against structural racism and police brutality lent even more urgency to discussing how we teach about the ways that national identities are shaped, contested, mobilized, ethnicized, racialized, or institutionalized. Now, there's no way that a small panel can ever do justice to all these topics, but we hope this is but a first step towards a larger discussion that frankly has to happen, and not just in ASN, but more broadly in nationalism studies. So for today's discussion, we've invited 4 experienced scholars to share their insights into how to approach teaching nationalism in turbulent times. You can read their bios in the chat window, but I'll also introduce them briefly now. Peter Rutland is Professor of Government at Wesleyan University and former editor of Nationalities papers. He has also taught at the University of York, Sophia University in Tokyo, and the European University in St. Petersburg. He teaches courses on Russian politics, nationalism, democracy and dictatorship, and political economy, and is currently working on a project entitled Visualizing the Nation, which explores how political nationalism has expressed itself through visual media, including film, television, and internet. Julie George is an associate professor of political science at Queens College and the Graduate Center at the City University of New York. She also is a visiting associate professor at Columbia University at the School of International and Public Affairs. She teaches courses on the politics of identity at the graduate level and genocide and ethnic cleansing on the undergraduate level, as well as courses on politics of the Caucasus, politics of Russia and the successor states, research methods, and other courses in comparative politics. Her research examines the intersections of ethnic identity and political behavior, state building, and regime transition. David Stroup is an assistant professor of Chinese politics at the University of Manchester. His current research focuses on ethnic boundaries in Hui Muslim communities, as well as the everyday foundations of populist Islamophobia in China. He has taught courses on nationalism and ethnic politics, the politics of China and East Asia, and comparative politics. Eleanor Knott is a political scientist and assistant professor in the Department of Methodology at the London School of Economics, where she teaches courses on qualitative methods. She is currently working on a book manuscript comparing kin-state politics using the approach of everyday nationalism in Crimea and Moldova. Now, I've asked each of our panelists to speak for about 10 minutes, after which we will have hopefully about 40 minutes to address questions to the panelists. Now, for those of you on Zoom, you can submit your questions at any time using the Q&A function, which we will be monitoring continually. We will also keep an eye on comments via Facebook for those of you watching live on Facebook. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Peter Rutland.
Okay, thanks, Paul, for setting this up, and thanks, of course, to the ASN for hosting it. And I only have 10 minutes, so I'll just get straight down to business and try and cover as much as possible and set the stage for the rest of the discussion. So we'll start off, of course, in the wake of the George Floyd tragedy with some points about racism and nationalism. And unfortunately, current trends in nationalism studies in our part of the world, in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, which is the main focus of the ASN, doesn't really prepare us very well to take racism into account. The trend nowadays is to see social identity, the socially constructed nature of national identities in the postmodern intellectual landscape. Scholars stress the fungibility and fluidity of identity categories, and race is just one marker among many such identity categories. In the US itself, of course, race unfortunately has a particular salience, or more exactly, white supremacism and white racism has a particular structural role in history and in the contemporary society. And therefore, racist categories and racist relations are not something which are particularly fungible and fluid or voluntary. They're more likely to be imposed. So this is nothing new, of course. It's as older than the United States itself problem. We keep rediscovering it every few years. What are the solutions? Just summarizing the literature in the nationalism field, how would nationalism scholars approach the problem of white supremacism in the US? Well, one answer, which has been raised for at least 200 years and was popular in the 1960s among the Black nationalists, is self-determination. That the answer to salvation for an oppressed minority is to have a state of their own. This is one of the core principles of nationalism since its emergence at the beginning of the 19th century. And so people have looked at the idea of African Americans having their own sovereign state. The problem is that with only 13% of the population spread across the whole United States, it's not practical and realistic as a possible solution. So the way forward is coalition politics. And again, there's a lot you can learn from nationalism studies about the complexities of coalition politics, because most oppressed minorities are minorities that can't aspire really to self-rule on a sovereign territory. So they have to make coalitions with other groups. And of course, cutting a long story short, the problem in the US is that with 17% Hispanics, 6% Asians, both of those groups very diverse internally, not necessarily having the same interests and outlook as African Americans. Is it possible to create a coalition which can rein in white supremacist forces in society by bonding with these other ethnic minority groups? The other long-standing solution is the idea of assimilation, that African Americans are central to American identity. There's no reason why they should have their own state. They should be part of the United States politically, as they have been historically and culturally and economically. And this hope for assimilation as a solution really was symbolized and actualized by the remarkable election for 2 terms of President Barack Obama. And despite that signal achievement, key issues of structural racism were not addressed successfully during his period in office. Okay, I think I just missed a slide. So moving on to the question of teaching nationalism. Main challenge I get teaching American students, I've taught students in other countries as well, but particularly in America, the problem is that nationalism is a dirty word. Nobody wants to admit to be a nationalist. I always ask my students on the first day of class, hands up if you're a nationalist. Usually nobody puts their hand up. Sometimes if there's a Taiwanese student in the room in Taiwan, it's still okay to be a nationalist, proud to be nationalist. Otherwise, it's a kind of dirty word in all branches of the English language, I think. I also asked them if they're a patriot, and usually in Wesleyan, as a liberal campus, usually only about a quarter of students admit to being a patriot. I also asked them which movie best expresses what it means to be American, and I don't have time to discuss some of the funny and interesting answers you can get to that question. What is the face of nationalism? Well, does it have an angry face? Typically, this negative connotations mean we associate it with angry people, with angry leaders, and this Hollywood Squares approach, you can figure out who is who, and this will be on the test at the end of the talk, whether they've changed their positions. But sometimes nationalist leaders are good guys and girls with a happy face. People who are associated with progressive historical achievements, where the social solidarity that comes from developing a national narrative can succeed in moving the dial of justice forward. But in general, the challenge we face is getting students to understand why good people can become nationalists or support nationalism and see nationalism as a solution, not just a problem. And COVID, of course, has made this worse because COVID has seen a lot of particularly pernicious and negative behavior from national leaders. How to do this? Well, I use Obama as an important example because Obama used a lot of patriotic language and symbolism and rhetoric in his rise to power. Also talk about cases like Ireland and Quebec, where you can see some sympathies for secessionist movements, but not very much. Most students tend to be very much with the status quo. And then we have movies like Gilles Pontecorvo's Battle of Algiers, which is, I think, the most successful movie conveying the idea of progress through national unity. And I won't mention Braveheart as a movie which, although apparently Fiona Hill recently said that Shamil Basayev, the Chechen terrorist, named Braveheart as his favorite movie. Other broad, and I'm drawing to a conclusion here, broader issues which affect all the courses we teach, the balance between theory and case studies, how many cases to include, which cases to include. You can't leave out China, you can't leave out India, you can't leave out the Arab world, but there's not room for all of these cases and all of the theories. There's a lot of theories as well. So a challenge we all face, I think, is which theories to include, how much economics to go in. Do we deal with top-down, primarily nation states that are sovereign, or do we deal with secessionist movements? How many? How much genocide can we fit into all of that, et cetera, et cetera. Final slide here, some tools that I found useful. I've been teaching this course now for 30 years. Tools that are useful, randomly assigning countries to get students to learn how to analyze a country, and also if it's a randomly assigned country, they don't have any emotional stake in it, so they can try and see both sides of the argument. And I encourage them to find people to interview from that nation. You can do it in person or you can do it by Skype to get a personal account. Also iMovies, you can train the students to make an iMovie in about 1 hour. The training takes 1 hour. Making a 10-minute iMovie takes about 24 hours of work. And instead of doing a class PowerPoint, they play the 10-minute iMovie, and you can find some of the examples of my students' work on my blog, nationalismwatch.com. It's been very successful over the years, and it does bring out the visual elements and musical elements, which are so important to nationalism. Finally, and I'm interested to see what other people say about in-class debates, I've had mixed experience with in-class debates. It tends to be polarizing, it tends to be simplifying. People will get angry without generating necessarily much light. Also a problem is that people tend not to have different points of view, even on something like the ban on the hijab in schools in France. I found with the Wesleyan students, it's very hard to find students who can really make the case for the government's position banning the hijab. So I'll end at that point and look forward to the questions later on.
Great, thanks very much for that, Peter. Next we have Julie George. Julie, you're muted. I don't know if you're aware of that.
Thank you, Paul. Am I better now? Is my screen available to you?
We're seeing the screen mirroring menu.
Oh, that's not good. Okay, I'm mirroring the wrong screen. There we go.
There you go.
All right, thank you very much. Sorry about that. Well, I'm delighted to be invited, and I thank you, Paul, for organizing this, and as always, ASN for providing such delightful collegiality in difficult times. I was excited to be invited to speak about this, and I was supposed to speak about this. We were supposed to have a panel on it at the on the in-person ASN that was ultimately canceled. And I was going to speak about my course on genocide, which I teach at Queens College. And so I've modified it a little bit, but not too much, because that is my pedagogical chops with undergraduates have been honed on the issue specifically of genocide. So while my title says Teaching Nationalism in Genocide, a lot of my examples, my pedagogical examples, will come from my history of teaching genocide. As nationalism scholars, a lot of things that we do, or ethnicity scholars, a lot of things that we do in terms of theoretical approaches, we tend to focus on those moments of salience where the essence of being of a nation or having some sort of identity is increased and enhanced at particular moments, right? And it's these notions that are the underpinning concepts, or underpin the concepts of constructivism and instrumentalism, that are so important to our analytical examination of nationalism as scholars, or ethnicity or political behavior for identity as scholars. I teach at Queens College at the City University of New York, and what's delightful about Queens, and what I've learned a lot about working there, is that for my students at Queens College, ethnicity, identity, nationalism, nation, race, religiosity, religion, these elements are always salient to them. Queens College is one of the most diverse colleges in the United States of America. Queens is the most, my zip code in Flushing, New York, is the most diverse zip code in the United States of America. And so as such, my experience working with my students is one where often there's a great deal of diversity in the classroom, and they take my class for specific reasons. So for one of the first things I'd like to talk about in my very basic presentation here, you'll see it's mostly just pictures, is about how to define class goals and how to approach the class with the idea of course goals. Now, probably all of you, or well, many of you, if you're part of the American or British system, have been bamboozled by college bureaucrats who want to talk about assessment and want to talk about what your course objectives are and how you're going to assess your course objectives. And I want to talk about it in a different way. I want to talk about it in terms of understanding not only why you are teaching the course, but understand why your students are taking the course. And for this, the experience of the genocide course is particularly relevant. People don't accidentally take a course on the politics of genocide. I should clarify that the actual title of the course is The Politics of Genocide and Ethnic Cleansing. They don't happen into that course. Some people like it because it seems like they think they'll see death, or they'll see kind of negative things. Others take it because they have a personal experience with it. When I first started teaching the class, I would have a line of senior auditors in my front row, because senior auditing is something that Queens College permits. And this line of senior auditors were Holocaust survivors, or parents, or not parents of Holocaust survivors, but or spouses or daughters and sons of Holocaust survivors. And so I immediately began to realize that the reasons why I taught the course and the kinds of ideas and especially theoretical goals that I had for the course did not match what my students wanted from the course. My students had a much more experiential approach inside the course. They wanted to understand their own history, or they wanted to express their own history or their own relationship with some sort of identity expression, whether it's being on the receiving end of systematic oppression, or whether it's wanting to understand a war that their family members were part of. And so in addition to my Holocaust survivors, I might have a number of people from the Balkans, both on the Albanian, Kosovar Albanian side or the Bosniak side, and then also maybe perhaps on the Serbian side. And so in the classroom, it would be an array of individuals, all of whom were seeking something from their own personal experiences, of their own personal edification, or own personal history, to sense something inside the class. And sometimes my course goals, which were much more abstract, much more theoretical, much more perhaps scientific, didn't always meet theirs. So what I then did do is I began to adapt my approach to permit outlets for them to be able to express or explore the reasons why they took the class, and then to dovetail it with the interest that I had in the class. And basically my interest in the class was to teach students why it is politically, or what theoretical opportunities we have to understand theoretically why states kill their own populations, or why power hierarchies exist according to identity, where people who are caught inside this contextual vortex don't get to express themselves or find themselves victims of the state. A lot of what I teach comes from the perspective then of the political advantageous, or the political power hierarchies of those who perpetrate the genocides or perpetrate ethnic violence. And so while many students came into the class wanting to understand what it means to be a victim of ethnic violence, my approach is one to understand the rationality, or understand the political framework of its perpetration. And so what we do with our class study is we find ourselves a place in between, where I can teach them what I want them to teach, so they can understand the broader analytical structure of systematic violence around identities, and for them to understand, perhaps give them an outlet for their more narrow, perhaps understanding, but personal experience that often has very emotional contours. Now, second thing I want to say, and this is something that's particularly important for understanding Queens College, but also understanding any classroom. I mean, probably those of you who are watching Zoom, you can tell that I am a white woman. And I teach at Queens College, and most of my students are not white. They're people of color in some capacity, or if they are white, their immigrant condition is much more, much more proximate than mine. I also happen to be Southern, so I'm from the South. And so one of the things I always have to interact with is the positionality in the room. And for this positionality in the room, it's important to understand, of course, to understand nationalism in order to understand identity, in order to understand the power hierarchies that get implemented by the virtue of someone's identity. Understanding that positionality and those hierarchies are extraordinarily important. My whiteness in the room is extraordinarily relevant for my being able to build credibility as a scholar and to provide context for my students to understand. So it's something that I explore early on. It's something I express early on. And I typically do it with humor. Making fun of one's own whiteness is often, I find, an advantage in a diverse setting. I also pay attention to the hierarchies in the room. I'm also the professor. I have power inside the room, and the students are very sensitive to that power dynamic. But that's the same dynamic that we see with ethnicity or nationalism or politics of the nationalism, especially within the context of where I'm looking at it, which is the perpetration of ethnic violence or identity violence in some kind of power hierarchical structure. And so being able to explore those hierarchies, being able to understand the room, understand the audience and one's positionality vis-a-vis the students who are engaging in the classroom, make it a lot, open up the classroom and open up the dialogue in an honest way that permits a lot more engagement and a lot more kind of context for them to understand their own experience and their own situation. I'll give you an example for this. For many of my students, it's very hard for them to understand their own identity, which is very interesting because at Queens College, people are very aware, people are in the classroom with hijabs. Most of my students are much more religious than I am. It's a place with a lot of religious conservatism. Typically isn't Christian conservatism. It's either Jewish conservatism or Islamic conservatism. And so you have different kind of shifts in the classroom between very conservative religious beliefs and then more secular or less conservative religious beliefs. In the same classroom, we'll have Christians, we'll have conservative Jewish people, we'd have less conservative Jewish people, maybe more Reform or not Orthodox, but maybe just conservative and Orthodox. And our Islamic community kind of runs the gamut in terms of practice. And so all of that's going to happen inside the one classroom. So having openness and engagement within that framework, I find is very useful. What I often do, if they feel comfortable, I might ask them if they want to self-identify, or I'll tell them stories about other students in other classes of mine that have self-identified. And they'll start talking off in one way, and then they'll find that they actually identify as multiple things. And that conversation, I find, helps them unpack these notions of various identities, about contexts pushing them into particular identities, and help them better then understand the later hierarchical politics that we discuss. And I can talk more about specific pedagogical strategies in the Q&A. My final real goal is to get them moving beyond their own experiences and their own categories of practice, where they understand their own position inside the ethnic space and understand things only within that frame of reference, and expand outward into categories of analysis. And in my genocide class, I do this by teaching them about the various, the various theories of ethnicity and identity and nation and nationalism, and give them the terms and give them examples. And then we talk about race. And when we talk about race, I show them this, this image, which is from a eugenics textbook that was in the Queens College Library in the 1920s. We used to have a major of race science at Queens College. And we talk about the kind of scientific structure, and they're used to people talking about textbooks. They're used to reading textbooks and seeing them from positions of authority. And here what we're doing is we're dismantling a textbook, and we are refuting its underlying racist context, right? And in so doing, they begin to understand, a number of things about science and a number of things about analysis, that it's something that it moves, and it's something that has a context that we as scholars can move beyond, and from a position of distance begin to interrogate and examine. So this task of teaching them race science so we can dismantle race science not only provides me an opportunity to dismantle the concept of race, but keep the concept of racism, right, as something that's real, but also begin to explore analytical contours that don't necessarily correspond with their own focal points or their own political interests. A lot of students take my class in genocide with the desire to highlight their own experiences inside a genocide and see their own experience, their unit of analysis is like their own, as a representative sample of something. And what I want to do is I want to zoom them out and say, okay, your experience is real, it's a valid experience, but it is a unit analysis in this broader contour, these broader constructs. And that allows them better to compare across cases. And it also allows them better able to understand structural discrimination, because so many students see things at that individual or even the institutional level and have a very hard time seeing things systemically. And these kinds of approaches help me showcase that. And I tend to do it iteratively. It takes about 2 or 3 or 4 times for them to really to kind of understand it fully and then apply it in a analytically rigorous way. That's all I have. Thank you.
All right, thanks very much, Julie. That was fascinating. Next, we have David Stroup.
Okay, let me pull up my slides here. Let's see. Okay. Are we good? Everybody see? Okay. Well, so thank you to Paul for asking me to be part of virtual ASN. And I'm really excited to talk here. Paul asked me to talk a little bit about innovative teaching and innovative assessments as a way of teaching nationalism. And one of the things that I want to use my time today to talk about is thinking about how we as teachers can take the concepts that we teach in the classroom and bridge them to our conversations about what happens in the real world concerning nationalism. Oftentimes, there is a bit of a disconnect, and I want to argue that one of the ways that we can try and do this is to use assessment to ask our students to think about how to engage with a broader discourse on nationalism and the nation. Recent months have really shown that nationalism and talks about the nation are central to many of our conversations about political, social, and economic matters, whether that be our current institutional and electoral politics, whether that be the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, or whether that be the protests led by Black Lives Matter in the wake of the killings of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and others. We see that nationalism has a very salient role to play in these conversations. And as we think about how to address some of these issues in our classes, I think it's important to note that there is often a disconnect between the way that we talk about nationalism in the academy and the way that it is appearing in mainstream and political discourse. For instance, while we in the academy often talk about nationalism as a socially constructed phenomenon, one that is made up of fluid identities that rise and fall in salience and that overlap with other intersecting phenomena, real life or real world discussions of nationalism often focus on nationalism as a concrete or biological political fact, either through the political agendas and rhetoric of nationalist political actors, or in the case of many of us, our contact with national identity is through entities like 23andMe, which reduce national identity to a percentage after you take a DNA spit test. These are notions of what the nation and nationalism and national identity are that students will bring into our classrooms. And when they do so, they may find that how we talk about and engage with the nation and nationalism is very different from how they have experienced it in their own lives. And this brings to mind a number of dilemmas and challenges that we have to overcome. For one thing, we have to overcome the confusion that arises from a seemingly long list of interchangeable or variously similar terms. After all, how do we talk about the difference between nationalism and patriotism? How do we define differences between state and nation state and ethnic group? Where do we draw lines between the convergence of race, ethnicity, and national identity? These are all variously confusing terms because in many cases outside of our classrooms, they may be used in a fundamentally interchangeable or variously similar way, and that may burden students who are experiencing this for the first time. Further, we ask students to treat entities which are often purported to be a fact or treated as being real out in the mainstream discourse as abstractions. And this may be hard to communicate to students who have never reckoned with these ideas before. For instance, introducing a student to the idea that the nation is an imagined community may be a very challenging hurdle for students to overcome. Similarly, when we talk about studying groupness but not groups, it may lead to student confusion. And so this is a very difficult set of literatures to become involved with, especially when the popular usage of many of these terms differs so clearly. After all, students are going to encounter definitions of the nation and measurement of national borders in a way that corresponds to the image on the right, where people identify in a census which identity they choose. But we may also ask them to think about how we can define national identity in different ways, like how you can draw the borders of the nation based on what you choose to put on your chips, or for my American friends, fries. The difference between choosing curry sauce or mushy peas may be as nationally significant as anything else in terms of drawing practical lived borders. the current context of the global pandemic has made this also very clear, as we see the many ways in which the nation pervades our everyday lives, whether it's national discourse about why wearing a mask is essential, whether it's hanging out signs to praise essential workers, or whether it's encouraging people to go out and buy a full English breakfast topping pizza for the 75th anniversary celebrations of VE Day. These are all ways in which we experience the nation that may not be apparent in either mainstream discourse or the way that students have conceptualized the ways in which they touch the nation in their daily lives. And we need to get them to think about how these things can be reconciled. And there are many ways in which we can do this. Obviously, innovative assessments are but one method. We talk a lot about methods to decolonize our curriculum and think about bringing in diverse voices to expand the way that we talk about the nation. But we also think about teaching at the intersections and thinking about making a central focus of our conversations about where race, ethnicity, and other identities overlap and merge. But in addition to these things, which we all can do with choosing our readings and structuring our courses, I want to think about how we can get students in their own assessment and their own works to think about how to clarify some of these questions. And I'm going to pose basically two ways in which we can use innovative assessment to try and clarify some of these confusing topics and to encourage a broader and more global conversation between our students and those outside of the academy. I want to think about the benefits of role play and simulation, and also thinking about outward facing assessments, which I'll talk about more later. So role play and simulation ought to be broadly familiar to any of us who have been reading in the nationalism literature. After all, Gellner's Megalomania and Ruritania as hypothetical case studies are things that we have all experienced in our own study of nationalism. On the right here, you see several images from my own hypothetical case study of the Federated Republic of Stroup, trademarked. These hypothetical case studies encourage students to think about how to concretize these abstract concepts, to think about how they can deconstruct how nations are put together by taking a hands-on approach. After all, asking students to take place in a simulated constitutional convention may bring to mind ways in which the nation is embedded in political institutions. Asking students to simulate elections in which political parties may align with nationalist interests may think about how ethnic outbidding or political institutions or political parties embed nationalism in their platforms. These kinds of simulations also encourage critical reflection on concepts that students engage with, thinking about how do I understand what we just did in this simulation? What are my thoughts on how I played my part? These are importantly activities that can be done in teams or can be done asynchronously. As we all think about how to engage with online teaching, having a role play module as an offline worksheet activity is a really strong example of how we can encourage this hands-on action in these virtual environments. Beyond that, we can think about taking our discourse from inside the classroom and directing it outward. I call this outward-facing assessment. I'm sure there's a more pedagogically correct term for this, but thinking about how we can ditch traditional assessments like tests and papers and encourage more interactive or examples that are geared towards outward conversation. In particular, assignments like infographics, podcasts, website building, etc. These kinds of assignments that encourage students to produce something that could be distributed to a larger public outside of our classrooms encourages not only synthesis of learned content from within the course with independent thinking on historical or real world examples, it also thinks about how to crystallize explanations about what the nation is, who is included or excluded, how the dynamics of national politics work, etc., into simple and direct explanations. This encourages students to think about what the basics of the concept are and trying to distill them into their most direct explanations. It also prompts consideration about how the nation might be in contact with any number of real world phenomena. And just to give you an example of what these assignments look like, here are some infographics that were produced in my own courses at the University of Oklahoma, where I was previously teaching. These are infographics that encourage a broad range of topics. And you can see that these assignments deal with things that are as niche and specific as the discourse around the hijab ban in France, as broad as discussions of how gender and nationalism are discussed in art, or even talking about political interactions like the politics of elections. All of these projects are easily produced with online templates. These students directed themselves to websites that were available with free resources and produced stunningly beautiful graphic projects that could be distributed to any number of public outlets and encourage any kind of discussion that would be stimulative of public discourse. And these don't have to be complex or complicated graphics. This particular graphic a student did on the current crisis of Uyghur internment in Northwest China is a profound statement about the crisis of ethnic discrimination that lots of people in Xinjiang province or Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region face, but it is very simple. It does not take a graphic artist to produce a provocative and very strong illustration of a powerful concept. And so I encourage all of you to think about incorporating some of these techniques in order to get your students to think about how we bring in these real world phenomena and talk about them with people that are not just professors and not just our classmates, but experts out in the real world. And I'd be happy to talk more about this later, but I think I'm running close to time, so I'll stop.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much, David. Finally, we have Eleanor Knott.
Great. Sorry, I'm just trying to work out. Okay. So I'm going to upfront myself as a methodological interloper. Thank you very much to Paul for letting me contribute to this session. I'm not so much going to be talking about teaching nationalism. Nationalism isn't something that I've taught for a few years, but I have been involved a lot with teaching methodology in a department of methodology. So today I want to talk a little bit about kind of how I go about teaching methodology from a kind of pedagogical perspective, and then kind of addressing the elephant in the room, which is all the challenges that we face when we try to think about transforming what we feel comfortable and what we feel trained and have experience of doing into this online setting, assuming kind of minimal training with distance learning. What are some of the challenges that we should think about, and what are some of the kind of potential solutions for the next academic year? I also wanted to upfront that my experience is very much or predominantly of kind of higher education in the UK, which has its own intricacies, so bureaucratic intricacies and idiosyncrasies, and in particular kind of expectations of students as autonomous quasi-researchers. So I think that the lessons that we can think about in terms of teaching methodology have, like, in a sense, all of the courses that we teach have implicit methodologies within them. So I kind of hope that this can also speak to some of the broader ideas of teaching nationalism that we've been discussing so far today. Okay, so talking about the kind of pedagogy of methodology even, one of the kind of obvious challenges that I face often is kind of engaging interdisciplinary content and interdisciplinary audiences. That's just the nature of the way that we teach methodology. But I think probably more broadly than that, methodology can often be boring. It can often be seen as like pointless, is the thing that you're made to do, but you don't necessarily enjoy. And I also think there's a tendency to think about methodology, or kind of how we think about doing research, as the way that we teach it can be quite depoliticized, can be quite vacuous, irrelevant, and devoid of engaging content. So what I want to talk about is how I try to fill that void and fill it with interesting content, with engaging kind of hooks, with diversity of examples and approaches that can actually make methodology fun and more interesting to students that might be doing this for the first time. I'll talk about this in a second. And I think one of the important then solutions is not just to think about methodology as kind of tools and techniques, but actually more fundamentally about the creation of knowledge and the opportunity to diversify knowledge, that we can train students to write in a way, to do research in a way that is challenging assumptions. And Julia was already talking about how you kind of narrow the gap between student experience and expectations and teacher expectations. And I've been teaching this course on case studies, process tracing, and comparative methods for 2 years. And one of the reasons that I even thought about designing this course was to provide a framework for students to talk about things that they really care about, often to research, to produce research on cases that they might be from or that they have an emotional connection with, but to be able to kind of transform that to a broader audience, to people that don't necessarily care in the way that they do about the context that they're talking about. How do they narrow that gap between themselves and that broader audience? So the way that I try then to kind of to socialize students within what we mean by methodology is through using a diversity of cases, using a diversity of authors, approaches, and perspectives, telling them that there's no like right way, but the way that I try to teach is ecumenical. You can do with what you want, how you want, but these are kind of this is the existing diversity. And in particular, one of the ways that I've tried to invest more content into the way that I teach case studies is by kind of upfronting extremely kind of politicized examples and trying to transform them into ways. So if we start with this common example together, how can we start to pull it apart? So for the last 2 years, I've been using the Holocaust as a way to start to build students' capacity to start to think of the flexibility in the ways that we can start to think of the Holocaust as a case of something. The Holocaust isn't intrinsically a case of anything in particular, it's a case of many different things. And that works in particular with an interdisciplinary audience, because the way that a sociologist or a conflict scholar or a development scholar or a geographer or a political scientist might think about the Holocaust might be very different things in terms of the level of analysis, the unit of analysis, but it provides a way for us to have this interdisciplinary discussion with a way that is very case-based. So there's a huge variety of the ways that you might think of the Holocaust as a case of something, of mass violence, of strategies of survival, of strategies of resistance. And by kind of unpacking that black box as to what the Holocaust is a case of, then we can kind of start to build the next, to answer the next question, which is what can we compare the Holocaust to? And in order for us to understand that kind of comparative lens, we need to go back to the basics of what it is a case of in and of itself. So I just wanted to kind of to flag up some readings that I've been working with. So Charles King text on the kind of the relationship between political science and the Holocaust is kind of fundamental in the way that I think about this. Evgeny Finkel's book on ordinary Jews, as well as like an amazing kind of way to think about doing comparative analysis, and also linking to this paper by Christian Lund of what is this a case, which again speaks very much to how you take a context that's very specific. He talks about Bolgatanga in Uganda, and how you start to think about that as more theoretically as a case of land reforms, land rights, post-colonial settings. So these are just an example of the way that I try to use hooks to engage students, to provide them with kind of practical tools and techniques to start really training them to think flexibly about the world in which they live and the ways in which they can make those choices. And also, to be honest, to identify that these are choices that they're making themselves, and to kind of to provide them with some agency for the fact that they are making choices. Sometimes they might be implicit or explicit, and to build a rationale as to, well, why are you making those choices, and to be able to articulate that rationale. I'm going to talk about, so I like to also combine these kind of very emotionally, but also social scientific examples with some silly examples that I'll get to in a second. But that kind of contrast of hooks between these extremely messy and fraught real kind of social science examples with these kind of everyday examples as well. And I just wanted to say also, I know that there's a kind of call for online syllabi right now. And on this course of case studies, process tracing and comparative methods, I've recently been doing a PhD workshop, and I have a bunch of resources that I'm happy to share. I've already shared them with virtual ASN, and I'm also happy to share them with anyone if you just want to email me, which has kind of 3 different sections on teaching case studies, teaching process tracing, teaching comparative methods, it doesn't really matter right now about what each of those different things is, but I just wanted to flag up that I'm super happy to share resources. Okay, moving to the silly examples. The challenge of teaching comparative methods is often, again, Julie was talking about this, the difference between the abstract, the way that we think about social science and producing social science research in a theoretical abstract way, and how we make that meaningful for students. And so when I think about doing Mills methods, I like to start, and I use emojis a lot in my teaching, with a very practical example where you start out at the beginning of the day, you have breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and you feel fine. But you have a friend who ate very similar things to you, but ended up feeling sick by the end of the day. And then you start to say, well, these are two very similar cases with different outcomes. This becomes a dependent variable, and this becomes a potential way to think about most similar comparisons. So even using the very practical everyday example of food poisoning, we're able to kind of demonstrate what methodology looks like in real life. And then again, this isn't this is the starting point, right? And then you kind of go on to more social scientific examples as well. And on the converse, we can also have a most different form of comparison, where you have another friend that eats very differently to you all day, but also ends up sick at the end of the day. And then you try to isolate what that similar item of food that they might have eaten. So in both cases, you and your friend ate a burger. That burger was the reason behind your food poisoning. And to be honest, I also teach causal mechanisms like this as well. It's about kind of tracing the trajectory from one dimension to another. So this is just to give you an example of a very silly example that I use. And one that pertains more, in fact, to the kind of ASN region from Asia, Central Asia to post-Soviet space. I also have recently started using the example of dumplings as a way to think about most different case comparisons. And I think this is also something that I'm going to use next year as I start to think about teaching online, as actually a question to be explored by students, right? So setting up with a puzzle, I always like to kind of provoke these puzzles. Why is it that manti, momo, pierogi, vareniki, pelmeni, ravioli, and tortellini are similar? Right? We have very different cultural contexts, very different food practices. They're made in different ways, they're filled in different ways, they're cooked in different ways. And yet what we start to see is that there's this kind of common dumpling culture across very different cultural contexts. And so this, to my mind, becomes a kind of most different comparison. How do we explain this common outcome of these dumplings existing in this kind of different cultural context? And what can we start to isolate that might be the potential explanation? So I use the Silk Road as the kind of potential explanation for this. But this is something when I'm thinking about how to transform my teaching for online learning next year, is a potential example that I would just throw out to them and then say, well, you have to go and kind of find out what the answer to this question might be. What is the kind of common thread that links all of these different contexts together with this kind of similar food practice? Okay. So yeah, I wanted to address the elephant in the room, which is how do we translate kind of everything that we've been doing so far, these courses that we've been working on and designing for years and have honed, into this rapidly shifting context? And how do we do that in a way that's not kind of consuming all of us and all of our time and all of our resources to do so? So I want to kind of speak through what I see as some of the challenges and also what I see as some of the solutions. This isn't my own individual work by myself. It's something that I've experienced through teaching this recent PhD workshop, but it's also something that Audrey Alejandro in my department has been speaking about a lot. So I don't want to kind of say that this is the individual work of any one person. But some of the challenges, and as the previous presenters were talking, I was kind of coming up with, yeah, how do you translate that to an online environment, right? How do we build online communities of students when we're used to doing so in person? How do we foster group interaction and participation that is often the key to success in the classroom when we have much greater distance from students? How do we start to ask them those difficult questions about nationalism and identity when we're really going to be challenged to getting to know our students across very big distances, across big social boundaries? All of that campus socialization, all of that kind of informal learning that we get from being with our students face to face is being challenged by the context that we now live in. How do we manage difficult situations in the classroom? How do we manage different student-teacher resources and inequalities that exist in an online learning environment and often are magnified in this kind of environment in and of itself? How do we manage student uncertainties and mental health and our own well-being and mental health in this kind of ongoing pandemic? Are we investing more in kind of pastoral resources for students, and what are the impact also of us as teachers in this? And one of the things that, I'm going to be very honest now, one of the things that I struggle with is feeling that what I'm doing is like good enough. And I think in particular online learning, we're very socially isolated right now. We don't have the support network so much of our colleagues. And I think the kind of the trouble then is of doubting yourself, of not having the idea that we're not experienced in this, we're not trained to do this, we're having to transform ourselves into online teachers at a kind of rapid pace. And I think the other problem is that we run the challenge of kind of creating needless work. Like, we don't imagine that this crisis will go on for a decade. So what do we have to invest right now to keep this manageable? How do we deal with the blurring of kind of the boundaries between public and private, between classroom and home? I'm currently inviting you into my house. What does that mean for teaching? What does that mean when we have to create new materials to kind of adapt to our online teaching, and when we have the time pressure of a busy semester, of a busy kind of online webinar? How do we kind of manage all of these things? And is our challenge really to become distance learning experts overnight amidst the context of and the pressure of a pandemic? Or maybe, I mean, one of the things that I'm kind of reconciling with myself right now is just to lower my expectations, right? We just try to get through this the best way we can. So rather than leaving you with a whole bunch of challenges, I started to think through some solutions. Again, Julie was talking about setting expectations as being really important in the classroom. And I think it's even more important when we start to think about online learning, right? What are the ground rules and expectations, and how do we match our expectations with student expectations, and being really upfront about that? I think being more directive is now better. So this is where I kind of have the conflict with, in the UK, we're really focused on students being kind of quasi-autonomous researchers, and the conflict then is between that quasi-autonomy and what can often be more helpful for students at this moment, which is being more directive. And I think the other kind of thing in terms of engaging with students is making ways for the content not only to be face-to-face, not only in the webinar or the lecture or whatever format, and not only student to teacher, but also providing ways that they can engage with each other, and that takes the burden off us slightly, that in some ways tries to replicate that campus socialization that they'll be lacking, and allows them to kind of have these peer networks that might otherwise be absent in the kind of isolated situations that they might be in. The other kind of solution then is kind of maintaining the engaging content and engaging with the world around us, integrating those examples of this turbulence of nationalism, in a pandemic. Maintaining those hooks, but transforming them for kind of, you're not necessarily giving students all the answers, but you're providing them with a set of tools that they can then go out and find the answers to. So transforming the content that we might have taught passively to sometimes being more active, and kind of then requiring the students to do more kind of active work in that. I think also, again, to be realistic, that we'll probably be able to do less, and less content at this stage might actually be better, that like those learning outcomes and objectives might actually be advanced more by trying to cut down on the amount of content that we seek to produce at this point. And very simple things like standardizing how we produce and disseminate content, that like we set weekly deadlines, that we set consistent tasks and expectations, weekly plans for students, which is a huge investment of time, but actually, if done well, might help to actually reduce the burden on us as well. Communication is obviously going to be extremely important. And I think also one of the things that I try to teach in my own classrooms is transforming the implicit to the explicit. So for example, if you're ever thinking about whether you should justify something in an essay, the answer is usually yes. I think we can adopt some of those similar strategies for online teaching next year to try and upfront the challenges that students usually experience and to be really explicit about that. And already as we start to think about next year and transforming content, thinking about what students already struggle with and what they kind of struggle to understand and how we can kind of upfront that in the content that we produce or reconfigure for next year. Don't think that's the last point. No. I also think there's a lot to be said for online technology, the trade-offs of that. But if your institution has access to Zoom, there's actually a lot that can be done to still foster small group interaction. And one of the slightly awkward things that I've been doing recently in these small group settings is to put them into breakout rooms and then to go visit each breakout room sequentially, to have more of that small group discussion that is like often really enjoyable in class, and to provide them with more of a space to talk. Because I think one of the, going back to one of the challenges, is that very few students might feel comfortable initially talking in that big group setting. And so breaking them down into smaller groups that you can also engage with within the seminar setting is kind of one way to do that. And yeah, and I think also setting expectations of ourselves and our institutions, like what is the cost benefit, to be really materialist about it? What are we getting out of this personally and professionally? What are the incentives for us to do this well, and how much time can we actually invest doing this on the one hand? And I think the less materialist implication of this is also to accept that we're learning on the job and from our students, and that we are facing a lot of challenges and those won't go away. We're not going to become distance learning experts overnight. We're going to learn a lot through this process, and we're going to still learn from our students as we did in the classroom. And that's a solution, not only a challenge. I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks very much, Ellie. So those are 4 excellent and thought-provoking and insightful presentations. I'm going to try to keep the focus here on teaching about nationalism, since that's the theme of the panel. Some of the questions, I think, branch more broadly out into sort of theorizing about nationalism, which is not really our writ at the moment. But I think they do raise some interesting questions. So I'm going to exercise moderator's prerogative here, in a sense, to combine some of those questions. I also want to note, for those of you who are raising hands, we're not using the hand raise function here. Please put your questions into the Q&A box, and we will do our best to get to as many of these as we can. To start off, I think we probably would benefit from pulling back to the big picture here. And one of the very first questions, and one of the biggest questions, is simply, how do we define nationalism? And is this something really we should be teaching? What kinds of risks do we need to understand as we approach the teaching of nationalism and bringing it into the classroom? And I'd like to invite Peter, perhaps, to reflect on this, since his presentation touched on these questions as well.
Well, the whole course is defining nationalism. So there's no cookie cutter definition. I mean, a brief idea would be that it's the politicization of a sense of belonging in a national community, but that raises as many questions as it answers. One point which I'll throw in while I have the floor is that somebody raised the difference between civic and ethnic, which easily maps on to this good and bad, which I think is a way we don't want to teach nationalism as good and bad. But at the same time, you can't avoid the normative dimension. It's too easy that other people are nationalists and I'm a patriot. Other people are bad nationalists, we are good nationalists. And that applies to ethnic groups with a political agenda within any given country as well. So I would resist that civic ethnic distinction. I think the literature generally has kind of moved on and recognizes that civic nationalisms, such as the French project or the American project, have a very strong ethnic core. And with respect to Black Lives Matter, one specific question addressed this to Black Lives Matter. I think it is interesting that Black Lives Matter has been able to get support from different ethnic groups. Whereas previous movements such as Black Power or Black Consciousness, that was more for the Black community itself. Whereas the fact that there's lives in there Black addresses the African American community, but lives, we're all living human beings. So any group can kind of think, yes, lives matter, all lives matter, and Black lives matter. So I think that's one way in which the Black Lives Matter has kind of bridged the civic ethnic divide. So I'm not sure if that's answering your question, Paul, but that's my immediate response.
Great, thanks. I mean, David, you also talked about sort of linking up the discussions, theoretically abstract discussions, with real world manifestations around us. I was wondering if you might also be able to reflect a little bit about how you move from definitions of nationalism into, you know, these making connections with contemporary manifestations and phenomena, like perhaps Black Lives Matter.
I think it's really important to, one of the things that I put briefly into a conversation I didn't get to talk about at length is the idea of teaching at the intersections. I'm reminded of Kanchan Chandra's 2001. I think it was in an APSA letter or something like that. It was a forum in which she challenged constructivist scholars to take the principles of constructivism seriously and to start thinking about, you know, what it means that identities can be multiple, overlapping, and fluid. And I think part of what we do when we teach that is to make that the focus of our courses, lead with that from the beginning and stress that these are overlapping terms that do often get conflated and used by political actors or society at large. I don't have any perfect answers, but I think you know, sort of taking the cases apart, looking at how social construction works, thinking about how nationalism is experienced in the everyday is important. And these are all ways in which we can begin to grapple with what these terms mean and how they intersect. I also think thinking about nationalism in terms of categories of practice and categories of analysis and what those mean is a really important way to do this. And so I was really taken with that part of Julie's presentation as well. So I don't have much more to say on that, I guess.
Great, thanks very much. I wonder, you know, if not just a matter of talking about how we define nationalism, but other sort of crucial terms. So for instance, defining genocide itself can be a highly contentious thing. Julie, would you perhaps be able to address that in the context of your own experience teaching?
Sure, and I can broaden it out a bit. Like I think the importance, what I do with teaching genocide, when my students come in, many of them want to articulate genocide, and they immediately want to politicize my syllabus. So my syllabus itself is a political entity because of what I include and what I exclude as cases, because of course there are more genocides than there are weeks in the semester. And so I have to be very careful about my inclusion in my language. And I use the terminology of genocide very deliberately and very explicitly, but I don't let the students, I don't give them an actual definition of it until the end of the semester. And then I have them build their own definition so that they can understand the political contours and the implications. And again, like, I'm always very transparent with that. I'm like, you know, I know that you want to have something to say about the Greeks or about the Turks or about the Armenians or about whatever group that they're channeling. And at Queens College, it's there's a lot of back and forth politically about Palestine and Israel and components about that. And so I can see questions being asked in order to say, well, the professor says that this is this sort of political act. And I'm very explicit saying, you know, I don't want to be a tool in your political debates. I want to use the tools that I provide you to advance your political argumentation in a self-aware, much more analytically grounded way. And I find that they're actually very receptive when I just take it on full on. If I'm trying to move around implicitly, I think they enjoy the chase. But when I say, you know, I'm not gonna engage in these polemics, let's just frame it very generally and then build to a much more precise definition. So something like the definition of genocide is actually one of the last things my class on genocide actually does. And what that lets them do is understand those political contours and understand not just political contours, but also the scholarly ones. And I think the same can go for anything: ethnic nationalism, civic nationalism, structural violence, all of those sorts of terms that are so loaded with meaning. And where we identify them as scholars, even in our place in them, perhaps we don't really understand or recognize the broader contours for others' experiences with it. And that forces us, in addition to our students, to engage it much more broadly.
Great, thanks very much. Have a practical question for Ellie, which is coming into an online teaching environment, especially where people are still recovering in a sense from this last semester, and nobody really has a full sense of what exactly is the appropriate workload, and how much we can manage. So how do you find that balance? What's been your experience in moving, teaching these complex concepts and filling them with both real world and silly examples online? How do you feel out what is the limits of what you can reasonably expect, not only of yourself, but also of your students?
Yeah, I mean, I remember there was a tweet like a few months ago that was like, we're not working at home, we're working in our homes during a crisis. And I don't know, when lockdown was announced in the UK, or even before lockdown was announced, when we were like, when campus closed, it didn't really feel possible that like we would suddenly be shifting to teaching in our homes and like writing in our homes and doing all of the things that we usually depend on office space for. But somehow we're kind of here 3 months later. I mean, I think the main thing is that like the whole time, in terms of saying to colleagues and also to students, is that like prioritizing our well-being is kind of the most important thing. Like whatever that is, like caring responsibilities, prioritizing yourself should come, I would say, before your job. And I also say that to students, that they feel guilty when they take time out. Like if they have to move back home and that takes 2 weeks, they feel guilty about how much less time they have for doing the assignments that they still have to do. In the UK, we run 11, 12-month programs where they're currently writing dissertations. And I think kind of flipping the script on that and saying, no, like you haven't seen your parent, you haven't been in that environment for a long time. What is important is making those social commitments, and everything else, like your papers will come when they need to. And I think just being flexible and being supportive at a time when that's kind of what we need of each other. And definitely, I think assuming more of a pastoral role, and as I said, being directive. Like probably last year I wouldn't have told my students so directly, once you finish your assignments, take a week off and then you can come back to the dissertation. But this year I'm being much more strict and kind of imposing some of those boundaries, and I get they're not deadlines, they're the opposite of deadlines. They're like, take a week out, because I think that they kind of need to hear that that's justified when everything else is kind of existing in this uncertain bubble. And that like, take time out now because you don't know what's coming down the road. Like you don't know kind of what your life will look like after this program as well. So you deserve some time basically. But yeah, I don't have all the answers to that question.
I think that's perfectly reasonable, not to have all the answers. The one other, I think, practical question I wanted to get out there while it's still available. The question was raised for David about software or websites that you would recommend for infographics. And maybe if you could expand a bit on how you design assignments for students to use images, and whether those are, say, individual or group assignments.
Yes, I saw some of those questions in the Q&A, and I'm happy to provide answers to that. My first answer is going to be that we are collecting resources at ASN for teaching nationalism, so I will be contributing some of my schematics, rubrics, and things to this if you want to take a more in-depth look at them. There are a number of ways in which you can engage with images. I like to give a sort of foundation on which students build, so that you're not just asking them to produce something out of nowhere. So in addition to producing an infographic, I ask students to do an annotated bibliography first. And so they research a topic, they provide an annotated bibliography that describes the kinds of information that they're going to convey. I grade that. give them feedback. The annotated bibliography is paired with a description of the kind of image they want to create, how they want to organize the image, so that we have a discussion between myself and the student about how they can structure different parts of the infographic. And then after all this feedback is given back to them, they produce the final product. Similarly, I do a podcast assignment where students work in groups to produce a podcast on a subject that is related to the theme of the course. In that case, it is very important that they submit not only an annotated bibliography, but an outline of the topics that they want to cover. That is, again, turned in before they turn in the final product. They get feedback, they record, and that's sort of a way that we ramp up to the final product. In terms of resources and availability, there are a number of free available apps that are either wholly free or have a free version that are available for trial. Things like Google Charts is important. An app called PictoChart, P-I-K-T-O chart, is one. Infogram, Visualize. These are all different apps that are available through stores like the App Store that students can use to produce free images. When doing audio mediums, programs like Audacity are great for recording and editing sound files that are also free and open source. But even just the voice memo app on your phone is something that you can use to record and even do some clipping and editing of audio files if you want. These are all things that I have created sort of materials and resources for that I will be sharing with ASN. So I will make sure that these get posted to the community pool.
Thanks. And I assume that we can ensure that those are also included in the collection of teaching materials that ASN is gathering on its website, which I'll mention again at the end of today.
Yeah, that's what I meant.
Yeah. Great. Thanks very much. One question, I wanted to sort of combine a couple of questions here. And this has to do with the ways that we tend to look at nationalism and sometimes patriotism as negatively. And this is something that, Peter, you touched upon in your initial presentation. Then we also have this question sort of suggesting that sometimes treating nationalism as a negative phenomenon also has sort of the unfortunate effect then of privileging and sometimes occluding the ways that Western countries have pursued certain paths of development while rendering those same paths as seemingly undesirable for other countries and other histories. So I wonder if you could maybe comment on that, since you pointedly make an effort of trying to break down those positive and negative associations and draw students' attentions to those.
Yeah, well, I think I tried to find cases where the students identify with or can sympathize, empathize with the nationalist movement. So, Polish solidarity movement in 1980, for example. So I don't think we can just pretend that we have no emotions. I don't think you can pretend you're just being totally analytical and objective and other people have emotions, but we don't. We scholars are completely just pure reason. No. So I think I go the other way, a more Weberian interpretive approach. You have to get people to emote for other groups which they don't belong to, which they're nothing in common with particularly. And that's difficult, and it's kind of dangerous in a sense that, you're playing with fire kind of thing in some respects. But I think it's important, and I think students can do it. And going back to some of Julie's comments, which I also encounter in the classroom, actually in the nationalism classes, I very rarely find people getting angry because everybody's kind of has a chance to work through their own identity dilemmas and to make the case for their group, if they have a particular group they're attached to. And so it can be very awkward. I had a Rwandan student whose family was massacred, Tutsi, in class one year. And yes, it can be extremely difficult, but at the end of the day, I think it's better to confront that head on rather than kind of not teach about Rwanda because he's in the room. On the contrary, it was terrific for everybody else to really get a sense of what it's like to live through a genocide.
That's maybe, Julie, would you like to maybe add on to that a bit? Especially because we also have a question sort of asking specifically, how do you go about teaching then about these very emotional kinds of contexts, like how one becomes a perpetrator? And, do you engage it through case studies? Is that something where you have to be, very mindful of the ways that people engage, not just analytically, but also emotionally in the classroom?
Yeah, I mean, this is one thing that differs from me from Peter. Peter is very much a visual guide, so he likes the documentaries, he likes the videos, and I am an avid follower of his. I was an avid follower of his YouTube channel and now his other stuff. I don't use as many of those because I find with genocide they're just overwhelmingly devastating. I do one documentary and keep it at that, and a number of others. I might post online for anyone who wants to see them, but they're not mandatory because of that emotive component. I try to, make it understandable, but also abstract. Just a couple of things. I don't find nationalism necessarily a negative problem. I try not to speak in terms of normative conditions like right or wrong or good or bad. And I even stop short of saying that genocide is bad in the classroom, although privately I would admit that it is, probably a pretty negative thing. I look in terms of power hierarchies and how they get perpetuated and how they get implemented, where certain collectivities of individuals are, by virtue of their membership of that collectivity, are diminished or put into a subordinate condition inside the society. Whether or not that's right or wrong is anybody else's value judgment. So I teach things like populism, I teach things like nationalism, I think I teach exclusive nationalism, and obviously genocide, which is a pure expression of that subordination, right? The massacring of an entire group, as something that is not necessarily good or bad, normative, whatever, but it's just something that happens and we need to understand its underpinnings. In terms of perpetration, I get at this in a number of different ways. We have a week on perpetration and we talk about like who is doing it. We talk about innocent bystander or the bystander effect. We talk about the innocence of the presumed innocence of victims and how we might approach a victim differently if we presume they're innocent, as opposed to thinking of them as some sort of assailant in a different condition. I think that's something that we see a lot with the protests right now with Black Lives Matter on some of the commentaries and some of the narratives, that, well, as long as they're looting, then they're not innocent victims, therefore we can treat them differently, or we can subordinate them without the normative pressure. And so I want to draw attention to how we rationalize and how we understand those things as humans and our own place in it, right? The human condition is one to fortify and protect one's own collectivity, often at the expense of another collectivity, right? That's the us and them. That is the kind of the basic building block of identity politics. Understanding where the power structures in around that are very important. Understanding that the cognitive need to do those sorts of things. So we look at, we do it a number of ways. We look, I do psychology, looking at some of the neuro studies from brain science. Most recent stuff, we do the Milgram experiment, but he was a Queens College alum, so I always kind of throw him in. The Zimbardo prison study is something that I skirt around. I used to do it more, explicitly, except now that some of that science has been unencumbered, I try to find some alternatives to that. But then we also read narratives of perpetrators. So there's a book, Machete Season, which is, accounts of perpetrators of the Rwandan genocide, which are very, very engaging, very interesting. The students really like those. And then other perpetrator debates. So the debate between Daniel Goldhagen with the, Hitler's willing executioners, which, provides a very broad understanding of the perpetration of the Holocaust. Or the Nazi genocide, which is what I refer to it, versus Chris Browning's book on Ordinary Men, which make it much more situational, and then understanding the perpetrators from a not empathetic position, but yeah, an empathetic position to understand the mentalities of and the needs that people are feeling when they engage in that kind of exclusive violence.
That's excellent. Thanks very much for that. I think probably we have time for maybe one last round of questions, and I might just put this to everybody for the remaining 5 minutes here. But I think it's a question that everybody is probably having to engage in some way or the other. But it's how do we approach the relationship between nationalism and populism in the classroom, especially given that it is now so wide. Both terms are now so widely used in journalism and in daily speech. It gets partly to the challenge that David raised in his presentation, where we have this, this gap between the academic use of terminology and then sort of the everyday use of terminology. But obviously these two are not only not going away anytime soon, but arguably becoming more and more pressing. So how have you approached that distinction in your own teaching, or how have you thought about, maybe being able to address that in the classroom in a meaningful way? And maybe we just go in order of the original presentations: Peter, Julie, David, and then Ellie.
Yeah, well, I mean, nationalism is older than populism, and it's a more of a structural phenomenon, whereas populism is more of a kind of flash in the pan, we can argue. But it's very useful to teach nationalism. So I start my nationalism class with Obama, when Obama was in power, with Trump, now that Trump is in power, because the students know that. And so that's a good starting point. And Brexit in Britain is also a nice case. So I think populism is a way to show how in the here and now, national identities are political tools which can be used to win elections, to win power, because that's what nationalism is all about. It's not about the past, it's about the future, right? It's about using the past, using stories about the past to win power in the present and control the future, right? And so I think populism and the upsurge of interest in populism is great for us as teachers of nationalism, because everybody's heard of populism and we can give them a context to understand it. And one of the points people made in the Q&A that we didn't get to was about Latin America, and that's very important to understand the rise of indigenous politics in Latin America and the way that Latin American populism, with its more left-leaning progressive agenda, is very different from the European xenophobic populism.
Great, thanks. Julie, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, the way I approach populism and nationalism is through the realm of regime type. And again, we're in genocide, so a lot of genocides happen in authoritarian regimes. But the Holocaust is lovely, not lovely, but it's a edifying case because it happens right after Weimar and the experimentation with democracy in interwar Germany. So I bring populism into the conversation about trying to figure out what to do when you have a mass population that is wedded to a particular hierarchy of power that has everything to do with an identity status that the higher position puts on the subordinate position that they seek to diminish. And that's not exactly what populism is, but it is one of the offshoots often of populism, and certainly one of the factors how we see it expressed in terms of immigrants, and how we see it expressed in terms of minorities inside societies. And so it becomes a useful tool for scapegoating. Not just that, but it is one mechanism for doing that. So I approach it through data. I approach it through public opinion data. I approach it through looking at the rise of particular parties that capture those positions inside society, or in times when you can see it inside the data and like the barometers, the European barometers, or these various other things, and then to see how it dovetails with political power inside legislators or inside a political authority.
Great. Okay, very quickly, sorry, David?
So when I taught nationalism the last time, which was in the spring of 2019, I had a specific week devoted to populism and nationalism, where we read Cass Mudd on populism, where we read Roger Strubaker on populism and nationalism. I did a case study in that week on the populist politics behind Brexit. And then I try and weave populism throughout my courses in our discussions of nationalist and ethnic mobilization, as well as nationalist and ethnic political parties, and also constitution making and other processes. Sorry, that's, I think, what we have time for.
Thanks. Last word, Ellie.
Cool. Sorry. Yeah. So incidentally, I teach a week on concepts, and nationalism and populism are some of the concepts that I try to teach. I mean, I'm not teaching the substance, but I'm more teaching students how to go kind of operationalize, like conceptualizing and operationalizing these terms for themselves. So I drew this little Venn diagram. Because what we need to teach students is ways to understand the relationship, right? That when they start to think that, I mean, the biggest question that I ask students is, what do you want to explain? And we need to use concepts to help us explain that. And do you want to explain nationalism? Do you want to explain populism, or the nexus in between the two? And then from that, we start thinking about ideas of ladders of abstraction. So kind of going from the abstract to the specific, family resemblances, and the whole way in which we can think about this kind of framework of concepts. And one of the reasons that I teach populism and nationalism is because they're so meaty as concepts, because they're inherently contested and there's no agreement. And that is a real world, well, not a real world, but like a real research example of say, democracy is the same, like how we have to go about traversing the many different interpretations of different concepts and kind of work with our own and generate our own. And to be honest, also like narrow down, right? You can't hope to explain nationalism or populism in the kind of research that the students might be conducting, but they might be able to explain something at the nexus of nationalism and populism, for example. So kind of scoping that down as well. I think that's everything I wanted to say.
That's great. Thank you so much. Thank you to all the panelists, and also to all the viewers for making time for this discussion today. Thanks to all those who asked questions, and apologies to those whose questions we didn't have time to get to. Before you go, we have a couple of quick announcements. Mindful of the fact that many of you are now trying to prepare for teaching in the fall, we would also like to facilitate the sharing of teaching resources. So ASN invites you to share any digital teaching resources related to nationalism, which we will organize and make freely available on the association's website. So send us your syllabi, send us links to online videos, including conceptual explainers, lectures, interviews, what have you, simulations in class or online, exercises, individual or group. You can send them either as attachments or as links in an email, but send them to virtualasn@gmail.com. This information is also on the association's Facebook page and website. I'd also like to direct viewers to ASN's website for more information about the association, including upcoming events and publications. And finally, we hope that you'll join us for the next virtual ASN event on how to get published with members of the editorial team from Nationalities Papers, which will be July 2nd at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So thank you again to everybody for being here, for your time and for your contributions. And we hope to see you at the next event.
Thank you, Paul, also for
Thanks, Paul.
organizing us all.